suitably admonished, I take it, by Ipso for your ghastly and ludicrous opinion that the mask-wearing study in Denmark actually said that there wasn't really very much difference in wearing one or not.
Yeah, the fascinating thing about this, I should point out here that most people wouldn't even know it happened if I hadn't taken very energetic steps to publicise it yesterday, because you're probably aware that an Ipso ruling is published in the newspaper, in our case, on page 2 at the bottom. It didn't name me. It's written in, well, how should I say, it's not perhaps the most enthralling part of the Mail on Sunday, which is, as you know, an enthralling newspaper.
It is.
So I drew attention to it because it seemed to me that the Press Standards Organisation, which is a body whose existence I defend because the alternative is almost certainly government regulation, has moved into the regulation of opinion. I've written in the Mail on Sunday 2 things about the Danish mask study, which eventually was published after much delay last November. The first one was a factual account, which has not been challenged or criticised. The second was a very brief sideswipe at it in the middle of an article about Facebook and censorship, interestingly enough. And actually, the words were in brackets. And yet this has led to this extraordinary censure. There's not an apology, it's just the paper is, under the terms of its agreement with Ipso, which we're obliged to do this, has published the Ipso ruling on it. Which I urge people to read. I have myself photographed it and put it on Twitter, and I think there are other ways in which you can easily access it, presumably from the Ipso website. But the fact is that here's the simple point, and I've made this many times. Before the Danish mask study, which was conducted in the spring of 2020, got underway, the general accepted position, both by the British government and the World Health Organization, was that masks didn't really do much good. So there was no reason to believe that they did. And so when this study, which eventually, after recruiting about 6,000 participants, actually compared the outcomes in about 5,000, half of whom had worn masks and half of whom hadn't, as to how many had become infected, they could find that there was no statistically significant difference between the two. Now, obviously, this doesn't go into the question of whether masks protect others, but in terms of whether they protected those who wore them, there was no advance on the previous default position, which was no. And there has yet to be any serious experiment on the widespread claim that they protect others. It remains a claim. So yes. There you are.
But what's interesting, Peter, and you'll remember this from the days back when we were kind of taken off YouTube, and there was a lot of nervousness around things that could not be said and things that could not be published. Whereas the whole situation has moved on now to the point where I think most people would certainly agree that there is no consensus, certainly on the wearing of what would be regarded as rather flimsy masks. And certainly the fact that the government has said that there is now no longer a legal requirement to wear one would suggest that it doesn't really help, wouldn't it?
I don't know. For instance, in various parts of the United States, there are now renewed campaigns after the mask decrees were dropped there for them to be worn again, and I would not at all be surprised if that happened here after whatever statistics are produced later on this month or in September. So don't necessarily assume not. I've always thought that the mask issue was very little to do with the technical evidence of their usefulness, and much more to do with the huge propaganda impact it has of seeing people all around you wearing these masks. Of promoting the idea that we live in grave fear and danger, and also giving everybody the opportunity to signal very clearly by wearing something on their face, not just a badge or a tie, but actually wearing something on their face, covering up half their face, declaring that they accede to the government's judgment of this. I think the politics has always been important. That's why everyone's so touchy about it. That's why my criticisms of mask wearing and of the claims that it is beneficial are so furiously attacked. Some of the attacks I get are absolutely virulent and astonishing in their anger,
yes,
and unsuppressed fury. And I just don't think as a subject it justifies that if it's simply about masks. It's about politics.
Yes.
It's about whether you agree to all this or whether you don't. And really, I've also been tweeting a lot about Jonathan Sumption's
I've seen that, yes.
good piece in about the Jeremy Farrar book in the Mail on Sunday yesterday, which is a tremendously good read because it's so beautifully put and explains what happens to people who think that they're cleverer than anybody else and their ideas are so good that everybody else jolly well has to follow them, which is basically what this kind of society we live in now. And look, here we are. It's 17, coming up to 18 months now, I think, of all this stuff going on. And any sense that we're ever going to get out of it seems to me to be increasingly hard to believe. I've said from the start, you think this is just going to be temporary? I don't know. I wouldn't be at all surprised if we weren't still discussing travel restrictions, masks, all the rest of it next year. And here's another thing. This morning we got a report which actually was carried on the radio of the British Bucket Company saying that that there has been a survey of trains and railway stations showing that there's no evidence of COVID around there. Now, actually, a very similar survey was published in the summer of 2020, and at that time, a parallel survey had been done on the German and Austrian railways. And I wrote about this. It wasn't impossible to find out about. Nobody ever said anything about it. And people have been terrified off trains by the belief that if you go there, some enormous great COVID virus is going to come and smack you in the face. The danger on railways, it's always seemed to me to come from other directions. But anyway, there it is. It's now actually being acknowledged what was already known from scientific survey a year ago.
Well, yes. I mean, I've found an awful lot of stories like that have happened this year. For example, many of the questions that certainly I was asking and you were asking as well last year have come to the fore. For example, the one last week where it said that about 25% of those people who were counted as having COVID and were admitted to hospital and as a COVID admission had actually gone into hospital for something else and had not gone into hospital with COVID at all and had only been tested once they were in there for some other reason and then declared to be part of those numbers, which led me to say that if there were 34,000 people in January in hospital with COVID because that was the high point of the disease and the infection rate, then something like 9,000 of them had gone into hospital for something completely different.
Well, indeed. My only surprise at that is that the figure of 25% was so low. I would have guessed it was probably higher. As we've often said, the place to get COVID in this country is a hospital. Yeah. If you haven't got it when you arrive, the chances are you'll have it when you leave. That's presumably diminished now as well, like everywhere else. There is obviously some sort of relaxation, but how long will it last? And I'm hoping to give blood again soon in this country, which I haven't been able to do since April. I say this country, I mean England. I haven't been able to do since April 2020 because of France and March. I'm hoping to be able to do it soon. I did actually go to Wales to give blood, so maybe the relaxation is there. But I just listen every day for signs that we're going to return pretty rapidly to another form of lockdown. I also worry very considerably. I always do in August. People say August is terribly quiet. I generally work during August because history shows that it's a very important month for major events. The biggest story I ever covered, the Russian putsch against Gorbachev in Moscow in August 1991. August, the First World War broke out in August. So many financial and political crises. So brace yourself for all kinds of things which may happen between now and the next bank holiday. I think it could be if the pro lockdown people get their way, it could even lead to a change in the leadership of our government. Well,
I mean, certainly Boris Johnson is playing fast and loose with his majority and his popularity, and he's becoming less and less popular with every day that passes. And so it's an interesting point that you make. But let's talk a little bit more about Lord Sumption, because he was on with Julie Hartley-Brewer this morning, and he made a very astute pronouncement, I thought, in which he said there is more to life than the avoidance of death. Which makes perfect sense to all of us who are listening to that, apart from, of course, the people running the government.
But as soon as you say that, then the hordes of fanatics gather around and say, "Oh, don't you care about people dying then?"
Yeah. Of course.
Any kind of discussion of this sort of general nature is immediately transformed into a shouting, screaming match of people yelling at you that you don't care about whether people die and you want to see the old die, and all this complete slanderous rubbish which is directed against anybody who and here it is again. You see, it's the intensity and fury of it. I in all my life, whenever I've come up against this, it's always made me think, well, why are these people so furious? And the more you examine their argument, there is a complete congruence between the fury and intolerance of the holders of a position and the weakness of that position. What they are is very worried that people will find out just how weak their position is. So any sign of dissent is immediately squashed with geysers and streams of slime. And that's what happens to people like Jonathan Sumption, and to Danish people like me. If we raise these questions, then there are. I'm amazed that he still continues to say it, given the way that he can guarantee to be misrepresented.
Yes. Well, one of the comments that appeared underneath that tweet that I put out of his quote was, well, he's had his life. He's an old man. Of course, he doesn't care about people's lives. And you go, well, that's completely the precise opposite of what he's actually saying. He does care about people's lives, and he wants people to have a proper life.
I know, and then there's the guilt by association stuff as well. You say about somebody that what he said is sensible, and then later on he says something that isn't sensible. So you're immediately made responsible as guilt by association smears for the unsensible things that you said. You haven't endorsed them. These are the techniques of totalitarians and show trials, thought policemen, not the techniques of rational, scientifically minded people in a free society. No. And here again, the sky is darkening. The ability to have this is what you do. This is what I do. We make our living. The best part of what we do is enabling rational, informed discussion of major issues in public. And this is becoming harder and harder. Say yesterday I actually got semi-officially censured for expressing an opinion.
Yeah.
Well, people say, oh, that's Hitchens. He deserves everything he gets. And I understand that people feel that way about me. I am the hated Peter Hitchens. But they should realize that if the principle is accepted, that even semi-official bodies such as IPSO can censure someone for expressing an opinion, then we are here on a slope which is not so much slippery as an avalanche towards the end of proper freedom of speech. Once this kind of thing happens, people can take two attitudes. One, they can say, well, we've got to fight against this. The other, which is much more likely, is to say, oh, well, I don't want that to happen to me, so I'll be more careful about what I say.
Yes, but that's the other thing as well, isn't it? Because in addition to being very vitriolic and angry and furious at whatever your opinion is, they're also very sure of themselves, or they claim to be, that they're right and you're absolutely wrong, where there is no background or backing for that position whatsoever. But I was going to ask you about IPSO, because we have the same situation with Ofcom in our business, whereby you can broadcast to 1 million people, all of whom listen quite happily and move along and have the rest of their day go and buy a cheese sandwich and sit and watch the cyclists in the park. One person complains and you could lose your job. Now, in your case, I don't know how many people complained, but it's probably just one person who complained about what you wrote, and you are forced then to have a newspaper apology printed.
Well, yes, that is how it works. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it in principle. I think that we are very bound to try to be as accurate as we can and to tell the truth. And the clause under which I was censured was actually an accuracy clause. That's what I object to. The aspersion was cast that I'd been inaccurate in a factual matter rather than expressing an opinion which is unpopular. But yeah, I deep inside me, I'm a First Amendment person. I believe the American system, where Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the press, is the ideal position. But we don't have that here. And over many, many years, the voluntary press regulation has developed, and is a shield against the much greater danger of official state regulation of the press, which to some extent is what you face in Ofcom, because ultimately it's a state-backed body. I think that to prevent this kind of thing, then we have to behave extremely well in terms of being accurate. But once that gets extended into the area of expression of opinion, then I think we're a wholly different, region of press regulation and a wholly different kind of society from the one in which I grew up.
Yes, I think that's right. Peter, stay with us for a moment. We're just going to take a little break. Peter Hitchens with us, Mail on Sunday columnist. We're going to talk about trains, we're going to talk about planes, we're going to talk about automobiles, and all manner of things coming next on Talk Radio. Welcome back to the Independent Republic of Mike Graham, right here on Talk Radio, also available, of course, on TV. Talk Radio TV is where you need to go. TalkRadio.tv is where you can find the app as well. We're talking to Peter Hitchens, Mail on Sunday columnist. Just before we move on to trains and other forms of transport, Peter, I just wanted to remind you that back in the point at which last year people were questioning an awful lot of what you were saying, I remember Facebook putting a warning on one of our interviews in which it said some of the information in this article may be misleading, which really annoyed me, actually, because I thought to myself, hang on a minute, between us we've got probably, nigh on 100 years of, maybe not quite that many, but not far off 100 years of experience in the media and in dealing with these various stories that we've been covering. And some dweeb in California with a couple of hairs on his chin has decided that it might be misleading because it mentions something to do with COVID that they don't agree with. And I thought that was the purview of Facebook rather than actual proper organisations like Ofcom and IPSO.
Well, there you are then, you see. But I just do feel that it happens, as always, by the process of salami slicing. One small piece here, one small piece here, but in the end, the whole sausage is gone.
Yeah.
And there was a certain amount of outrage over what Facebook did, but in my view, nothing like enough. And Facebook remains immensely powerful and unrestrained force in our society for whatever it is a force for. And the general attitude in our trade, the general attitude in public opinion is one that the area of things which can be discussed should grow narrower rather than wider.
Does that mean that
that's the way it's going?
Does that mean that you would hesitate to endorse the government's plan on this new online safety bill, in which they claim that they're going to threaten some of these big tech companies with massive fines if they don't control certain aspects of what they do?
Well, things often aimed against bad things often backfire on those who do them. The classic example of this is slightly different, but the national curriculum, which the Conservatives tried to impose on the schools, has ended up by being yet another way by which, how shall I put it, left-wing ideas have been increasingly inserted into the education system. So that didn't work. If you make it a principle you're going to start fining people, then how long will it be before those fines are turned against the sort of people that you and I think more highly of? I'm wary of it. I don't quite know what is the right approach to Facebook. I think that in the original sort of trust-busting years of American government, when American governments thought it was their duty to curb overmighty subjects, it would probably have been broken up. But I don't know whether any government now has the power to do that. Our modern sovereign governments, perhaps with the exception of the Chinese, who don't seem to have any objections to censorship, are any modern sovereign governments in existence with the actual power to break up these large bodies? I'm not sure that power even exists.
No,
they are so big. I remember when I was a Labour correspondent, everyone said, well, the trade unions were overmighty subjects. They came to an end pretty much in the Thatcher era because we stopped having any industries in which they could recruit members. But this doesn't look like the Facebook or the rest of the tech giants don't look particularly vulnerable to me to any obvious political or economic wave. And I fear their power. I think it's very worrying for free society.
Yes, I think that's right. Let's just end with something that amused me in your column this week, which was your recommendation that the rather ludicrous idea of hooking buses up to overhead cables was actually something that had already been invented some decades ago. It was called a train.
Yeah, everybody's constantly moving towards inventing this fantastic thing called the railway train. Yeah. The cleverest invention in transport ever, fantastic, but which we in this country madly destroyed in the 1960s and continue to treat like the poor relation of our transport system. It is, everything about it is so good. And the key thing about it, I keep saying, the friction between a steel wheel and a steel rail is so much less than that between a rubber tire and a tarmac road. that the use of energy by railway transport is enormously lower. Leaving aside all the other things, it looks nicer, it doesn't make so much noise, it doesn't create so much stink, it can be fed by electric power gained from practically anywhere. Yet, we have a department for roads, which is almost hostile to railways. If it can't actually close them down, it breaks them up into mad, impossible, illogical arrangements where the trains are run by different people from the track and all the rest of it. There's a hatred of railways around the world among bureaucrats and governments. South America is now practically devoid of them, for instance. Only really in Western Europe and Russia and China are they still even an important means of transport, and yet they are so good. Why is it we can't recognize this? Railways everywhere, Cape to Cairo, Moscow to Jerusalem, Paris to New York under the Bering Strait. Build them, electrify them, and travel by them, and send your goods by them, and see just how many benefits society gets. But we won't do it. It's crazy.
I know, it really is. Peter, great to talk to you as ever. Thank you very much indeed. Peter Hitchens there from the